All right, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. We have our webinar on financing mechanisms for nature-based solutions. We're really happy that you're here live, but I do want to note that we will be recording this session so that anyone who missed out can watch later. My name is Sarah Mason. I'm a Senior Policy Associate at the Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability at Duke University. And I'm just going to kick us off today by briefly introducing the webinar series that this session is a part of and our speakers today, and then we can dive right into presentations. After all the presentations are finished, I'm going to pass the mic off to Grace Edinger from the Environmental Policy Innovation Center, which is co-hosting today's session, and she will be moderating the Q&A. So if you do have questions for our panelists, please type them into the Q&A box that you can find at the bottom of your screen. And we can try to get to as many of those questions as possible at the end. So this webinar is the second session of a series called Current Issues in Nature-Based Solutions. And with a lot of growing interest in nature-based solutions coming from both the public and private sectors, along with a really strong desire to try to scale up implementation of these types of projects, we wanted to host a series of presentations and conversations around nature-based solutions, effectiveness, execution, funding, and policies. This series is being hosted by the National Ecosystem Services Partnership, or NESP, as well as the Resilience Roadmap Project. Just to give a little bit of background on those, NESP is a coordinating platform for a network of public and private individuals and organizations working on implementation of ecosystem services concepts at the national level in the US. And the Resilience Roadmap is a project aimed at gathering expertise on climate resilience policy in the US and making actionable recommendations for how to build greater climate resilience through federal action. And we are very lucky today to have the Environmental Policy Innovation Center's Restoration Economy Center co-hosting the session today. The Restoration Economy Center works to increase the scale and speed of high quality, equitable restoration outcomes through policy change. So if you're interested in any of those hosting organizations, I just posted links to all of those in the chat if you'd like to learn more. I also do want to note before we start that we have a few upcoming sessions of this series scheduled. The next is on January 12th on federal cost-benefit analysis policies for evaluating nature-based solutions. That session is being co-hosted by the Coastal Flood Resilience Project. And then we have another session planned the following week on January 18th, where we will be joined by the authors of the recently released Nature-Based Solutions Roadmap for the United States to talk about the rollout of that plan. We also have a few other sessions kind of in the works, so if you want to stay tuned as we get those scheduled, we'll be releasing emails and social media posts about how to join those events. If you'd like to stay informed about these and other upcoming webinars, you can sign up for the NESP mailing list. That means you'll get our quarterly newsletter and future webinar announcements. And you can do that either using the QR code on the screen or through the link that I will post in the chat just after this introduction. And with that, I will now shift us to what we're really here for today, the presentation. So I'm going to make very short introductions and hand it over to our first presenter, Tim Mayle, who's the Executive Director of the Environmental Policy Innovation Center, which he founded in 2017. Prior to launching this startup, he served as an associate director at the White House Council on Environmental Quality and in various leadership roles at national conservation nonprofits. He's a former elected official and has a PhD in conservation biology. So I'm going to hand it off to Tim. I will introduce the other speakers as they begin their presentations. So Tim, whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Great, thanks so much, Sarah, and thanks to everybody joining us today. Tim Mayle, and as Sarah mentioned, I lead the Environmental Policy Innovation Center. And just give me 1 second and I'll start my slides. Here we go. So the mission of the Environmental Policy Innovation Center is trying to find policy approaches that will lead to faster progress, faster public health progress, biodiversity conservation, carbon sequestration, whatever it might be, or what we're trying to find are ideas that would lead to faster progress. And usually that means some kind of risk trade-off. You have to do something with a little bit more of an edge to it in order to move faster. And this isn't nature-based infrastructure, but one of the best examples is lead pipe replacement. Every developed country in the world, as far as I know, has lead pipes. No one particularly wants to keep them, and we get public health benefits for every day we remove them earlier. And so finding ways to reduce or to remove lead pipes faster is just and sort of a full stop public good. So that's an example of something that EPIC works on, but we're going to talk today about financing nature-based solutions. It's a little weird to talk about financing nature-based solutions, of course, in America right now, given all the money that has just come out. This is an example of many of the programs. These circles are roughly scaled toward the size of the money. So Farm Bill programs, just to give you a point of reference, going toward conservation, much of which you could call nature-based, is $18 billion. A lot of money in the Clean Water Revolving Loan Fund at EPA, which I'll talk more about. Also could cover, green infrastructure, nature-based projects. And so there's a lot of federal money right now. So at one level, I just had to reflect this in my remarks to say, our most important challenge at this moment is figuring out how to get this money deployed effectively toward the kinds of projects that we all care about. And the analogy I'd use a little bit when I think about the challenge is sometimes we build really complicated structures and we're trying to really sort of outthink the status quo and figure out how to build something different. But the analogy I would use is it's like having a bunch of professional basketball players in your house, or at least in my house. It just wasn't designed to fit them. And so for nature-based solutions, often the problem is that policies, the details of programs, the staffing and the qualifications of staffing just don't match up with the kinds of projects that we're trying to pursue that involve nature. And so it's sort of a practical or a pragmatic challenge of just fitting something different in. And I'll describe some of that work because I'm going to focus in particular on some legislation we worked on that was all focused on nature-based infrastructure, or green and blue infrastructure, as we called it, in this legislative effort that moved forward in Maryland, in the state of Maryland in the US. So just sort of 3 slides for context that were really important to us around scaling up the financing for nature-based projects. The first is that in the United States, we've got a market of something like $4 billion a year of transactions involving stream and wetland protection and restoration. A large proportion of that money, or those projects, depend upon private finance, at least to get them started. A subset of them are subsequently paid for with federal or state or local money, but another subset is paid for with private compliance dollars. So that's an example of a space that has very much scaled up and is continuing to maintain that scale or grow. In Maryland, a second sort of pre-existing condition for the effort on green infrastructure that I'm going to talk about was that more and more data is showing up around opportunities for better pricing on nature-based outcomes. And so these in blue and in green are different types of contracts used at the local or state level in the state of Maryland. Everyone from the State Department of Transportation to counties in the state who are using different contracting mechanisms, some of which, the green bars of which, involve private or other monies paying for projects to be completed before the government agency will complete the contract, carry out the acquisition of the nature-based outcomes in those projects. And so data started emerging showing just how cost competitive or really effective different approaches to contracting were that depend upon really different financing streams to get projects started. And the third piece of context I wanted to add was that there were some innovative structures that had been pulled together in Maryland, public-private partnerships or community benefit partnerships that were set up to show not just that you could deliver nature-based infrastructure in a cost-effective way at scale, but also that you could deliver local jobs and jobs to minority and women-owned firms. And so this is an example of the jobs outcome from 2 comparable counties with the same kind of water quality challenges in Maryland, with the Prince George's pie chart, the one on the, at least on my right, showing the huge percent of jobs that went to minority-owned businesses. A similar percent of the jobs went also to local businesses, so employees within the county or within surrounding areas. And I wanted to mention this example because it is known statewide as a really effective model of deploying projects at scale. hundreds of projects, in this case, hundreds of green infrastructure projects to capture stormwater across the county. I think it was something like 200 last I looked. So small projects, mostly on private lands, being deployed by a partner, a corporate intermediary that was both tracking the jobs and the job training and loans and project deployment. So we worked on something with partners in the state administration, the governor's administration in Maryland, as well as with the legislature, called the Conservation Finance Act. And the Finance Act is like a 50-page piece of legislation that includes no new money, but it's basically a set of all those tweaks needed to fit really tall people into small houses, right? It's a set of tweaks to existing state programs to make green infrastructure a priority for the programs or just eligible for programs. That's sort of one side. So things like recognizing watershed as infrastructure, allowing loans, water infrastructure loans for forest preservation, creating a Blue and Green Infrastructure Commission. Those are all examples of ways of just trying to fit these approaches into pre-existing state programs. The other thing the bill did was focus on the contract side that I mentioned before. So creating the first, as far as I'm aware, first definition in state or federal law in the United States of an environmental outcome that can be purchased through the procurement code, the contracting and acquisition code for state agencies. So defining environmental outcome as something that can be bought as a good as opposed to as a service, and then authorizing contracts across many state agencies that enable them to buy those outcomes when they're delivered at the end of projects, as opposed to always paying for activities and construction or implementation, at the beginning. So the Finance Act we started working on it in 2019. It took 2 years to pass. And often with a lot of these programs, it's a long slog of working to get them implemented afterwards. It's really exciting because some of these provisions, including because there's all this new federal money, are now getting implemented in the very first year of the law being in place. Just a couple of highlights from the bill. Equal footing for green and blue infrastructure. So the law says that it's equally financeable to traditional infrastructure projects. It defines what blue infrastructure is. In other words, projects that are located in marine or ocean or Chesapeake Bay habitats. It does things like allowing loans for forest conservation, for forest management, for forest restoration. And then it makes a green and blue infrastructure a priority for the state revolving loan funds, that program that I mentioned earlier. And I'm not going to read this, but these are the definitions of blue infrastructure and green infrastructure now in state code. One of the reasons this is key is because it just clarifies for state government employees that they can do something. Often people don't want to take on a new activity because their program, their code, their handbook doesn't say expressly that they can do it. So a big part of what these authorizations and these definitions are there for is just to make it crystal clear that a state program manager is authorized to use these approaches. I mentioned the state revolving loan funds. Those are one of the biggest sources of new money from the IIJA, the infrastructure law that was passed in the United States. But this is the historic history of these programs, and the colors don't matter so much, except to see that these are loan programs, so the money gets repaid back into the government account that makes the loans, and that the number has been growing. And in fact, at this point, the repayments provide a stronger basis for new loans than the new funding from Congress or states. So the state revolving loan funds are really one of the biggest games in town when it comes to shifting money toward green infrastructure. At present, it's only about 3% of this money that goes to green and nature-based infrastructure. So, what we were looking at in the legislative changes in this package were ways to help basically up that total. So the changes that the bill made in the state revolving loan fund, the Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund, are shown on this slide. And again, I'm not going to read the details of this slide, but it's a handful of things from allowing nonprofits or for-profits to be able to access the loan guarantees. In other words, to be able to borrow money from the private sector using the credit rating and the backing of the whole state government as the guarantor of their loan to be able to get a lower interest rate. It created a grant pathway for disadvantaged communities to access some of this money. It allows money to be spent across state lines. So in other words, if there's more cost-effective green infrastructure projects in Pennsylvania, Maryland can buy them because they provide downstream benefits to the waters of the state of Maryland, to the Chesapeake Bay. And in a number of ways, it brought in green infrastructure and blue infrastructure as a priority for future loans under the program. I mentioned procurement before. The law, this is the definition of environmental outcome that's built into Maryland's statewide procurement code now, that is accessible by all the environmental agencies and agriculture agency. Under state law, there's 10 types of contracts that the state can use, state procurement can use. Pay for Success is a new authority. Pay for Success for the purpose of purchasing environmental outcomes is a new authority in the state. And so that's a subset of the pieces that were in this Financing Act. We believe that these kinds of changes are needed in every state in the country, as well as in federal agencies. And many of these same changes, would in different form need to be reflected in international laws. And they're really all about just giving permission to focus on nature-based infrastructure as a priority for existing programs, because often that's the barrier. It's not that it's radically new or that agencies don't know how to issue contracts. That some of the peculiarities of financing nature-based infrastructure just take some explicit permission to make happen. Oops, there's animation here apparently. There we go. At the state level, these are examples of other efforts that we have seen and that we are so excited by across the country, where other states in the United States have made shifts in policy that are leading to a big scale up of nature-based infrastructure. So for example, New Mexico and Washington State's teachers' pension funds are putting pension dollars now into ecological restoration. That's a great example of a shift in the environment toward much bigger scale up, right? These are pension funds that can't invest anything less than like $50 to $100 million at a time. So happy to talk about any of these with anyone afterwards. I'm not going to go into detail now, and just wanted to say thank you. And I'm looking forward to Tim and Jason's comments.
Thank you, Tim. Well, from one Tim to another, I can now hand it off to Tim Wigington, who is the Vice President of Finance and Policy at the Freshwater Trust. Tim is responsible for developing the transaction and business models necessary to fund, finance, and deploy watershed scale solutions, as well as pursuing legislative, regulatory, and policy changes that will drive more funding and programs towards integration, speed, and results. And so I'll just remind everyone, if you have any questions for Tim Mail, or as the future presentations go on, any future questions, please type those into the Q&A and we can try to get to those at the end. So Tim W., take it away.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks for having me on the panel. And thanks, Tim, for the great comments. Awesome stage setting for everything we're going to talk about here today. So, and I apologize ahead of time. I'm still in the midst of a cold, so hopefully my voice lasts here. But last decade, the Freshwater Trust, which I'll refer to as TFT, shorthand as we go, we've been engaged in the development and enabling of over $1 billion worth of outcomes-based, nature-based solutions. Just a sampling of those is a $350 million watershed restoration program for Idaho Power Company to help them relicense their hydro facilities, a big 600 million plus groundwater replenishment and habitat restoration program in the Sacramento area of California, and then $40 million worth of water quality trading for municipalities under the Clean Water Act. So we're of course very proud of the programs, but compared to the scale and urgency of today's water challenges, it's just not anywhere close to enough. And as it relates to water and lots of nature-based solutions that are by definition usually small and scattered across the landscape, and not necessarily having a great business case to be implemented, we need scale to be driven by public investments, at least to start, because otherwise it's just there's too much friction in the system. So So while it's great, and we're so happy to see this huge federal investment coming through that Tim highlighted so well with that graphic, unfortunately, I think just adding cash isn't going to guarantee the kind of results that we need unless we also pair that with an upgraded funding framework. So today, I just want to focus on some of the technology and policy levers that we think are necessary to kind of upgrade what we effectively have as a retail project by project, grant by grant system into something that's more wholesale, that's outcomes driven, and that can be coordinated and mobilized much more quickly to deliver a whole lot more nature-based solutions. So looked around a lot. The only thing that I think is able to actually get us to that scale is having some sort of functional economy around this stuff. And so that's why I imagine EPIC has a restoration economy center. But I think that's not the way that things operate right now. And so how do we get to watershed scale in a way that makes farmers money, that makes businesses money, doing the right thing here? To me, that is the singular question before us. For that to happen, you've got to have demand, you've got to have buyers, obviously, right? You've got to have having projects make good business sense for the people who are going to host those projects. And you've got to have consistent enough signals to businesses who can say, hey, I could make money doing that. That sounds like a good thing to get engaged with. Getting those three things happening has been really difficult until it's just been difficult. We haven't had the tools or the setup, and I don't want to butcher Tim's analogy, but we haven't had the right players in the right room playing the right sport here, and so you have a lot of people who are maybe under 5 feet tall trying to play basketball together. So maybe, I don't know, Tim, maybe that's a stretch. But I think moving forward, thinking about those limitations is pretty important. And one of those that I want to highlight, and I'll show a quick video here, is how technology now enables us to identify some sort of uniform transaction currency to think about how we quantify these benefits and then can transact on them in a way that we haven't had in the past, which has made it a whole lot more necessary to have these kind of complicated project by project programs to ensure that we're making good investments. So I'm just going to show a quick video of some of the work that the Freshwater Trust has been engaged with. We think that this technology could be a really critical part of how we get to scale on nature-based solutions, and is a pretty fundamental characteristic to an outcomes-based program. So I'm going to share my screen here.
By prioritizing restoration projects and quantifying benefits, the Freshwater Trust can deliver radically better environmental outcomes for less cost. Let's take a look at the irrigated fields of the Crooked River Basin. Fertilizer runoff in this watershed has led to algae blooms, and little has improved in decades. With a traditional approach, over $100 million would need to be spent to change things for the better. But our tech shows how for less than a quarter of that cost, we can focus on only the top 10% of projects and solve the issue. Let's show you how. First off, even from space, you can see this reservoir is an unhealthy green. As you see in a bird's eye view, without precision analytics, it's nearly impossible to know where to start tackling this problem. The Freshwater Trust mapped all 4,000 irrigated fields in the basin. We quantified improvements possible throughout and found that only 1,500 of these fields could generate any real runoff benefits, mainly through upgrading irrigation practices. That means 2,500, or 60%, have little to no impact on the problem we're trying to solve. Yet what's staggering is that nearly all 4,000 currently qualify for the same conservation funds. Without this technology, making a big impact on river health is a shot in the dark. That's how traditional conservation and restoration funding currently operates. We think of it this way. Why do you perform an X-ray? To find and solve a specific problem That's also what makes these tools matter. To solve the problem in a cost-effective way, we are looking for the best deals. There are plenty of bad deals here that we can now see, and traditionally, many of these may get funded. Our analytics show that by spending $25 million on the top 10% of projects, 60% of nitrogen runoff in the basin could be reduced. This would fix conditions downstream. That's the power of having an X-ray view. Without this knowledge, we wouldn't know where to work or how much improvement is enough to fix this complex problem. Better, smarter choices like these are available in basins around the world. Now, for the first time, we can see them.
Thanks, Sarah. And I saw a question pop through, what kind of technology is this? So I'll cover that real quickly here. So it's all publicly available data. It's just aggregated, automated in terms of how it's put together and then visualized. So it's in the background running, like nutrient tracking tool, for example, is the tool that's being used. But currently that's set up as a project by project tool. And so all that we've done is automate it, scale it up to the watershed level, and we can do that for lots of different pollutant types or other types of water savings, for example. So from a how do we get from where we are to where we need to go perspective, that seems like a pretty important piece from our perspective, to move the ball forward. Unfortunately, the current public funding system isn't necessarily oriented in a way that allows us to take that information and transact on it. And the biggest limitation is that you've got lots of agencies and municipalities or whoever it may be who only want to focus on a piece of the problem or fund a portion of a project. And so you get a lot of fragmented fractional buyers out there with a lot of funds stuck behind hard to access programs, and they don't necessarily play well together because of match funding constraints and other criteria. And so what you end up happening with nature-based solutions in large part is the burdens are left on those with the least capacity in the system, individual farmers or local groups who have to go through that project by project process. And if they're successful and they get a project out, it can take a year or two. And unfortunately, you don't have that kind of coherent, integrated lens for how do we invest in enough projects at the right scale so that we can address this large scale problem like a nutrient issue or not having enough water. So pretty similar to a lot of the stuff that Tim was describing. I think there are a number of targeted policy tweaks that we can make to have a big impact without having to reboot the entire system. So if you leverage that technology, you can unify all the fractional buyers around watershed outcomes. And that can be defined in a pretty similar way, uniformly to what Tim had up on the screen. Then if agencies and other utilities who are the primary buyers of this stuff in the system currently say, hey, we're going to buy outcomes, we're going to commit to purchase nutrient reductions or water savings, then that's where you start getting to the scale where conservation finance can really start to play. That's go and take a package of $50 or $100 million worth of projects to a pension fund. They can actually start to invest in that. It's pretty hard when it's a $200,000 project and there are 150 of them across the landscape. They're not currently packaged or ready for investment. And so building this kind of outcomes-based system is pretty fundamental for us to really challenge and move forward, overcome the challenges that we have in front of us. A lot of that has to then be translated into simple contracts for people on the ground. Instead of it being a complicated grant program, have a landowner say, hey, we want to buy outcomes from you. Your project can produce 50 pounds of nutrient reductions. Here's the price of nutrient reductions. Do you want to participate? It really simplifies the conversation, makes it a whole lot easier and faster to move money. So you get those benefits that flow throughout the entire system. So on the policy scale, we're working in three main areas. One is the Watershed Results Act, which is a bill currently before the Senate that we worked on closely with Senator Wyden's office. create a handful of watershed outcome pilots with outcomes defined essentially the same way that Tim described in the Maryland context, complete the analytics so that you can set targets, set prices, and ultimately lead toward, help a watershed develop a plan, a funding plan, not there's a lot of great science out there in terms of watershed plans, but not a ton that goes into, well, then how do we actually implement this and pay for this specifically? So the act would require that. It would add up to $30 million a year per pilot watershed to actually just directly purchase outcomes instead of having to run that through grant programs. It would build on, there are a few programs in the federal family that allow federal leverage together. That's a significant constraint. And so the bill would authorize that in these pilots. And then it would require, similar to what Tim described in Maryland, pay for performance contracts with landowners so that you could easily and quickly move that big leverage pile of cash to the ground to projects for folks. So that's a bill that would run through the Department of Interior. My dog's barking, sorry about that. And then Tim and some other folks are working closely with, including TFT, we're working closely with EPA to try and replicate something similar in terms of pilots and authorization so that we can get point source regulated buyers participating in this economy, so that we can get the SRFs, hopefully get packages of projects to the SRF so that the states can really mobilize and participate. And similarly in the Farm Bill context, really thinking about how do you get programs like the Regional Conservation Partnership Program plugging in, so that in a lot of different ways you can start have these giant buckets of money start playing well together, playing nice, and ultimately purchasing outcomes. So what that might look like, I don't know, do we have enough time to show one more 3-minute video, or do you want me to just put it in the chat?
I think we can show it.
Perfect.
First, the good news. The federal government is now making the single largest investment ever in water. With drought intensifying, inequity widening, and food insecurity deepening, it comes at a crucial moment. Now, the not so good. The right funding and implementation infrastructure isn't in place to ensure this momentous investment is successful. That's why, despite spending trillions of dollars, more than 50% of America's waterways remain impaired. The status quo approach is just not working. Fortunately, we have a scalable solution that will drive success. For nearly 40 years, the Freshwater Trust has delivered practical, optimized water solutions for farmers, cities, agencies, and rivers by leveraging a unique combination of technology, finance, and policy. We have navigated the gauntlet of conservation funding, permits, and procedure to enable more than $1 billion in innovative solutions that deliver the best projects for the least cost. While we take pride in this progress, accomplishing critical work at scale shouldn't be so difficult and slow. We need a new and repeatable investment approach that combines and concentrates funding, matches those funds to the best projects, and eliminates complexity for everyone. This solution would have 3 steps. 1. Integrate siloed funding into a watershed outcomes bank that matches funds to projects and keeps track of everything. 2. Use precision analytics to quantify and identify the best projects. 3. Recruit and secure top projects with strong, simple financial offers. Let's dig in a bit more on the obstacles. First, the funding. On the funder side, we spend billions a year on conservation, but it's uncoordinated. Therefore, results are diluted, making it difficult to show measurable returns on taxpayer investment. On the ground, it takes years to navigate complex funding programs and financial realities to complete a single watershed project. This process is risky and uncertain, with countless procedural barriers. Many water users can't stomach the hassle and hazards, so they don't participate. We need an approach that addresses both sides of the problem. Instead of requiring projects to navigate so many hurdles just to have the possibility of securing funds, a watershed outcomes bank can leverage 21st century analytics to identify the best portfolio of projects to recruit. Then organize, consolidate, and deliver funds to those projects via simple contracts that make it easy for a landowner to say yes. This clearinghouse approach is efficient, simple, and driven by public data and models, so every taxpayer dollar is maximized. It would also be backed by a project management and accounting system that tracks and organizes projects, funding, and progress. This does not require a complete system rebuild, just a reorganization and a few new parts. Our solution is about rapidly getting the right projects on the ground, delivering results while minimizing waste and red tape. Any hope of success hinges on an upgraded approach that meets the urgency of this problem. We must act now.
Great, thanks, Sarah. I think I probably took a little bit more time than allocated, so I will be done. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Tim. Sorry for those few technical glitches, everyone. And finally, I'm very happy to welcome Jason Lee, who's a director at Quantified Ventures, where he works to develop outcomes-based finance models that enable faster, more efficient compliance with existing regulations. His work has included developing pricing models for a financial mechanism that allows municipalities to pay for conservation practices on upstream farmland, the design of a governance and financing entity for nature-based solutions to water quality problems, and the structuring of environmental impact bonds to implement urban green infrastructure pilot projects. Go ahead, Jason.
Thanks, Sarah. And Tim, I feel like you pretty much said a lot of the things that I wanted to in my presentation. So all good there. Some of the themes that you touched on that I think are really relevant in our work at Quantified Ventures, the friction, I think was the word you used in public funding streams, and getting them to the products where they need to go, whether that's regulatory friction or technology barriers, or even getting boots on the ground. Those are all really critical. And then the importance of pairing all possible funding streams together, funding and financing, all capital sources together to get things done. Is kind of what we do. Let me share my screen. So I'm going to talk a little bit about who we are at Quantified Ventures, how we work, what we do, what our approach is, and then dive into a case study about financing nature-based solutions and monetizing ecosystem services. And I think the solutions that we work on, there's been a lot of really great examples from the previous two speakers about innovations in policy, innovations in tech to try to reduce some of those barriers, reduce some of the friction. And at Quantified Ventures, what we do is we really focus on the organizational and financial structures to try to lubricate some of those projects and funding streams. So working to all the way starting from design of these organizational and financial structures to actually loading them up with capital, and then trying to scale the ones that are successful to drive capital to some of the solutions, both on the societal front, but also on the environmental front. And we are a for-profit company, but we are a B Corp, meaning we kind of try to live that dual dream of how do you have sustainable private sector solutions that are explicitly focused and solely focused on doing good for the planet and people. So we work in a couple different areas, so I won't go through every little word here, but working on the environment and resilience front, in water resources, forestry and land use and agriculture, and also on the health and human services front. A lot of the nature-based solutions that I'm sure the audience works on could fit into any number of the buckets in our environment and resilience bucket. But and we work kind of all across the spectrum, sort of by necessity. All the folks that want to do things differently. You can there isn't any one place where they're found, or any one sector, or any one level of government or organization. There's lots of people out there who are looking for different types of solutions, different ways of doing things, more efficient ways of doing things, more financially sustainable ways of doing things. And then similarly, different organizations are needed, different, types of partnerships are needed to get the solutions on the ground, because they aren't either well known or established enough to be rote and have people, just doing that. Or, in the policy, there isn't a space carved out like there is in Maryland for this to be a thing, or even in Maryland, it's, what is this, like year one or two of the Conservation Finance Act, and getting the ecosystem of partners and service providers and implementers and also, administrators in the public side who understand how that machinery should work and works most optimally. We're still in the very, very early stages in both the public and private sectors. So you're going to need to cobble together all kinds of partnerships to make them work. In our particular approach, when we're trying to set up these financing and funding strategies and solutions, is focusing on the outcomes. It's kind of been a theme across all of the speakers today, but really focusing on these two questions of what are the benefits of the project, and what are the financing structures that leverage these benefits in the best way. And in the lower left-hand side, kind of a simplified diagram, but if you think just in terms of what I think of as kind of status quo or business as usual ways of trying to fund these projects, you have your budget, your in-house budget, and then you have external, philanthropic funding that can come in, or grant funding, whether from philanthropies or public sector. But that isn't always enough to actually get some of these projects done, especially nature-based projects. And so our approach is, well, if you take as a first step to quantify all the benefits that are quantifiable and verifiable, whether those are job creation, health impacts, carbon sequestration, stormwater management, and then stack those on top of your existing resources, it can often be viable. And the key here being that the outcomes that you're quantifying don't all have to be leveraged in the same way. Some of them are directly monetizable, which is awesome. Carbon being probably the most mainstream one of those. Stormwater not too far behind. Water quality also in the mix, but other outcomes like especially jobs, health impacts, maybe the evidence base is still being built up, or the societal acceptance of those as a monetizable outcome are still, that's still maturing. But if you can still leverage those to gain more support, gain new partnerships, gain philanthropic funding or public funding. And so a lot of the art and the science of what we do is, maybe there should be a third question here is what are the benefits? How do you leverage those benefits? And what are the financing structures that knit everything together into one picture? And the case study that I'm going to be talking about is going to illustrate that. I'm going to be talking about the Soil and Water Outcomes Fund, which is our fund that at this point spans, I think, over a dozen states, working to put conservation practices on agricultural land. And I think the problem of more sustainable farming or more environmentally friendly farming is, I think it embodies a lot of the same qualities of a kind of a prickly challenge that the previous speakers have talked about, right? There's it's really complicated politically, really big dollars, really big stakeholders in the mix, really big environmental damages that could potentially result. So how do you balance all of those? And the solutions that we try to come up with try to sit in the middle of all of those and find a financial structure that not only meets everybody's needs and creates a win-win, but also can facilitate the transfer of capital. And our particular financial structure here was raising a blended fund that houses both investment dollars and grant dollars that we manage to fund conservation projects in partnership with our nonprofit partner, who is the Iowa Soybean Association. And they're much more, closer to the farmer, on the ground, technical assistance type folks. And it's been a pretty successful model. And this came, all the way, it was kind of gestated in-house and made it all the way through that spectrum of, feasibility study, design, capitalization, and scaling. And as I said, the challenge, you all are probably pretty familiar, upstream, downstream, eutrophication, agricultural runoff, water pollution. Nature-based practices can solve a lot of those challenges in one go, cover cropping being one of the big examples there. Edge of field practices, on brownfield, wetlands or nature-based treatment facilities. The problem being that they're really costly to fund. They're too costly for farmers to do themselves, even the ones that care about conservation and want to, do good by the environment. And then federal programs, as previous speakers indicated, often come with a lot of bells and whistles, or sorry, hoops to jump through and paperwork to fill out that doesn't often make it appealing for farmers to do so. And even then, the payment isn't always enough. And then on the other end, on the environmental impact standpoint, it can be difficult to validate and quantify those impacts. So kind of at a high level, what we do is actually, I'll move to the next slide. We start off, maybe step zero is we just raise a bunch of money, right? We raise, as I said, investment capital coming from, private investment dollars, impacted investment dollars, but also the state revolving funds should get a shout out as being, the biggest impact investor probably on the planet. And then grant dollars, both from private philanthropies and foundations, but also the public sector. And then once you kind of raise all that money, you start to build some momentum, and you can go out and say, we have enough money for this amount of acreage, and we think we're gonna, based on our models, this amount of environmental outcomes that we're gonna generate both in water quality and in carbon. And then we can secure offtake agreements from potential buyers who are interested in saying, oh, okay, well, if you have that amount of scale, I'll take this many, carbon credits for my sustainability goals, or I'll buy this many water quality credits for, my regulatory compliance goals. And you end up with the money on one side and this kind of sheaf of offtake agreements on the other. And with that in hand, now it's kind of time for us to go out and figure out how we're going to make good on that promise. And we work directly with farmers to propose some of the new conservation practices that are going to generate the outcomes. And farmers can pick from a menu to say, here are the outcomes that are the practices that you can do, and we pay them up front. We say, here's, I don't think it's 100%. It's let's say like 90% of the payment. Beginning of the growing season, here's enough to cover your costs. We want you to cover crop. Do these nature-based conservation practices while you're doing your farming. At the end of the growing season, we'll go out and actually monitor those practices. We'll use USDA approved models. We'll do some satellite modeling just to make sure the entire field is covered, and then we'll go out and we'll ground truth it. Soil and water sampling, actually going out and visually verifying that the practices were done. And then once those outcomes are verified, the farmer gets the remaining 10% of the payment. So the key there being, it actually, farmers are not only compensated, but it's profitable for them to do these conservation practices, which is a win-win for them, right? Getting it, they think of it just as another part of their farming activities, right? At that point. And once we have those verified outcomes and those farming practices have actually generated those outcomes, we can take that sheaf of offtake agreements and go out to the outcome customers and invoice them saying, hey, at the beginning of the year in January, you committed to buying, X tons of carbon, and you over there contributed to buying or committed to buying this many pounds of phosphorus or nitrogen. And here's your invoice, here are your payment terms, and then in X amount of days we'll have the money flowing back in, which replenishes the fund for us to be able to pay farmers again in the next growing season. As I said, a big part of it is making sure that this isn't just a whole greenwashing exercise. We actually go out and verify that the farmers have done these conservation practices and planted the green things in the ground. And this model, we initially piloted it in just a couple watersheds in one state in Iowa. And we have now moved to 200,000 acres this year across 14 states, expanding even further. I think that makes what now 18 next year. The outcomes customers, as I said, some of the outcomes were leveraged and not explicitly monetized, and that forms the grant portion of that blended capital stack. But the customers that are helping us directly monetize some of those outcomes are in both water quality and carbon sequestration range from the public sector municipalities and their utilities that want regulatory compliance offsets, multinational corporations seeking ESG, commitment help, federal and state agencies looking to more efficiently procure the outcomes that they're after, and then environmental nonprofits who want to support good work and are also, in the watersheds that they care about. They want to support programs that help them achieve the environmental outcomes that they're chasing. Because of the use of the SRF and that blended capital stack, the Stolen Water Outcomes Fund won a 2022 EPA Pisces Award for innovation in using SRFs. And then exciting news, just a month ago, we won $180 million from the 2022 USDA Climate Smart Ag Program, which was part of, I believe, I want to say it was the bipartisan infrastructure law. So, on the note of, I think there was a statement earlier about, there's all this public money coming down. How do you make sure it goes to the right places and the right projects and the right people, the right communities? I think a big part of that is how do you make sure it's deployed in a way that maximally also crowds in private dollars, and having a structure like this, I think, is a really important part of doing that. Not just having the grant dollars or the federal funding be one-time grant dollars that go out the door and make a lot of impact, but then progress kind of plateaus again. Using this as a launching point to say, this is going to be leveraged into 60 million additional dollars in private capital that are going to be brought in. That was contingent on the public funding coming in. It's an extra 50% right there that's going to help us scale and drive more outcomes in the future. So here's my contact information. Happy to answer questions offline or sidebar and follow up. But for now, I guess we'll jump into the Q&A, and happy to answer questions here too. Thank you.
Thanks, Jason, and thank you, Tim's M and W, for those great overviews. I see that we've had some questions answered already in the Q&A as the presentation went on, so you can check those out as well. But I'd like to kick us off with sort of a broad overview or high-level question about where the greatest opportunity lies for increasing financing, either public or private sources. So I'd like to just start with Tim W. first. Where do you see opportunities growing right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is federal investment. Currently, there's so much money out in the system, and as Jason just outlined, it's got to find the right home. Otherwise, we run the risk of spending a lot of money and still having the same major problems that we do now. So that, plus the fact that so many of these nature-based solutions need a subsidy or some help in order to be viable as projects, to me that really nods towards getting the public dollars lined up as your buyers. And if you do that and you get enough of those, then I think that's where private capital can really start to provide an accelerating and expanding function. The risk has to be mitigated in a way that it's currently not with the way that we, in large part, deploy public dollars. But once we do that, then I think it can really catalyze and to Jason's point, pull in those private dollars, the insurance dollars, the pension dollars, impact capital dollars that are out there, but that, we go to all these conservation finance conferences and those folks are always saying, like, why can't you just bring us good projects at, institutional scale that produce 10% returns? Like, what are you guys doing? So I think, to me, that's why I think we are all collectively spending so much time on public sector dollars and making it a lot easier to get those deployed and concentrated and aggregated.
Anyone else?
To build on that as well, I think that the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law, the public dollars can help make the numbers work for the private side of things. Like if the overall capital need is 20% and you're seeking 10% returns, if so if you need 10% returns, you need $2 million. But if the federal, let's say the federal public dollars coming in can sponsor like 50% of that, then the project actually only needs to generate 5% returns, right? And so as a whole, because then that entire 5% can be shunted to the private investor who's only ponying up half the dollars, and making the ROI work from that perspective. So I think for that, it can be pretty transformative and make a lot of projects viable that wouldn't be otherwise. The other thing that I'll mention there is like the lining up of the funding and the technical assistance, that definitely can't be overstated. And I think in as much as you can roll in those costs into the financing, I think a lot of the challenge that we see, or that we've seen prior to the Inflation Reduction Act, and I'm hopeful that this is going to change, is you have a lot of implementers that need grants to be able to get future grants. You know what I mean? Like they need the grants to be able to do the design work and the lining up conversations with landowners and sketching out what the partnership is going to be and building the plan. But if you can roll those up just from like a private sector lens as project development costs, and then in the Soil and Water Outcomes Fund, we've thankfully been able to make the unit economics work, where all the verification and farmer outreach and enrollment and the modeling and the pre-verification, if you will, are all rolled into that outcomes price. But that is only possible because of that blended capital stack of the super low interest loan from state revolving funds, and also the public and private grant dollars that are in there. So I think there's kind of two ways in which this tsunami of federal funding could really make a difference in trying to bring in private capital.
All right, thank you guys. Sort of on a similar note, we've had a couple questions in the chat about Philanthropy Capitalism and its role in this whole thing. And so I'd love to know, I think someone asked specifically, Jessica, if there are specific examples that you guys could touch on that come to mind, or links that we could provide that would lead folks to like concrete examples of philanthropy capitalism. It's okay if not, just think on it.
Don't know of any links. But I do think that, all the things that Jason was describing there, verification, project development, monitoring, even just managing, a bundle of projects, and then figuring out how to pair money and financing and all that, like public dollars don't pay for that all that well. And so that's where it doesn't have to be a huge volume, but it can be extremely catalytic if you're trying to do that aggregation and coordination function, to have flexible dollars that can pay for those critical functions, so that you can keep the public dollars a whole lot more focused on actual projects, which I think that's kind of the lane that they're supposed to stay in. So I know that it's not directly on point to your question there, Grace, but I thought I would.
And I mean, I think that there's it's hard because it's such a broad question, but one of the slides I had on there showed the wetland and stream mitigation market, which is in the billions of dollars of annual transactions. Some of the largest companies doing those projects are backed by large investors, many of whom would, I think, fit this. There's no definition of philanthropy capitalist, but they fit that definition. Like large family foundations, right, are putting investments into companies that specialize in just doing ecological restoration. That I can't think of any more concrete example that is just a clear return opportunity from doing good through nature. So those are really big successes. There's lots of like pilot projects and small scale efforts, but I'd rather just focus on where it's happening at scale, which is those examples.
Sure. Jason, I'm going to switch over to you, hoping that you can talk to us a little bit about green banks and dedicated programs that have come out of green banks focused on funding nature-based solutions.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one, just in light of the carve out. This must have been one of your bubbles, Tim, but in the Inflation Reduction Act for potentially, I think it's like $27 billion in green bank funding. My understanding is that to date, green banks have largely been focused on renewable energy implementation. And green banks, it's kind of an amorphous term, but it essentially means like a mission-focused bank that makes loans at more forgiving terms to green projects. And there was a time where wind and solar really needed that because they were emerging technologies. But now that you have more mainstream capital, mainstream lenders, big banks, investors of different mainstream kinds investing in wind and solar directly, I think there's a need for green banks to shift towards the next generation of kind of experimental or leading edge projects that have environmental benefit, which are nature-based solutions. And right now, I think it's yeah, I mean, it could be huge, right? And the challenge is getting green banks to build up the initial internal capacity where they're like really good at underwriting renewable energy loans. How do you underwrite and vet green infrastructure, nature-based solutions? And green banks, I think they're at varying stages of acceptance. Some green banks are a little bit more well-resourced and progressive and have more technical expertise and are able to make that step. But I think it's a step that needs to come in the future. And I also think that I'm optimistic about it because even in the 5 years, I think it is, that I've been at Quantified Ventures, nature-based solutions and green infrastructure has gone from something that is everybody should do this to oh, everybody is already thinking about it and wants to do it, and frankly a lot of people are doing it. And so I think the role of green banks in helping to accelerate that even further is going to be really critical in the near future.
Awesome. Tim's, any other thoughts?
Chris, I just add in green banks. I mean, we're going to get to a point where green banks, and Jason, you referenced this, green banks are competing with private sector capital and scale that already exists. And so I think one of the things that's missing from green bank legislative authorizations that I've seen are the sidebars that narrow where they work in that innovation space that Jason described. Because the thing that happens repeatedly when talking to impact investors is they start saying, well, we want the return to be as high as possible and the risks to be low as possible, which is a logical thing to think if you're, if that's sort of one of your main drivers, and you need legislative authorization to say, no, you have to stay in the high risk space. So, not that Cylinder was a good outcome, right? But we need more of that kind of risk tolerance in the nature-based solutions space, as opposed to just really safe, projects.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think that's, we called it the outcomes bank in a video, but really it's that aggregation functions, the ability to bring together different buyers or different grantors, different investors, so that you can get to scale. Because whether it's the SRFs or impact capital or a formal green bank, you still have these same challenges around too many transaction costs with small projects, too much risk, not enough certainty around returns. And so that's why capital goes to big, centralized, predictable projects that have, clear payback streams. Renewable energy, even you can sell electrons at least, in an ag project space, you don't have that same kind of cash flow off of the land necessarily that is marketable and transactable. So I think regardless of what you call it, getting to scale and figuring out how to collide these things together that are currently operating in silos really seems like one of the principal needs for this sector writ large if we're going to get to scale.
Thank you all. There was another question too, before we kind of talk about international landscapes and what's going on in Europe in particular. I just want to call out a question we had that came before the webinar asking about specific opportunities and challenges for recognized tribes. And so just interested to know if you know of any opportunities. I think we can speak to some of the challenges, but for maybe expanding it out to like low income and minority communities, any thoughts about like the equity spin on some of this stuff.
I mean, Grace, I'd add that in the Conservation Finance Act, and we can send around to participants a link to some of the summaries of that bill later on, it puts environmental justice at the middle of many of the same programs where green infrastructure or nature-based infrastructure is also a priority. I think one of the pieces that's missing is just figuring out how to really optimize co-benefits from nature-based projects so that you're generating recreation, health, other amenity benefits and deploying those projects. But there's lots of evidence that this kind of work does that. So I'm not sure that the challenges are that different from what we've already described on the scaling side in terms of getting capital to be available. But one of the definite challenges is how to have an inclusive process of talking about which projects and where should they go. And it's not unique to this particular piece of infrastructure. We need to do it across all kinds of infrastructure choices, but we still need to do it.
I think it's probably important too to have a couple of different equity lenses at different levels in this space, because clearly we need to invest in historically disadvantaged communities, make sure that the dollars that they need for frontline stuff like not having lead pipes and raw sewage and those things that are just fundamental, access to clean water. We need to make sure that that happens, and that this investment helps remedy those challenges. But I think there's also this higher, maybe a more macro lens to put on this, which is connected to the outcomes-based framework, which is one of the most equitable things we can do is get watersheds and ecosystems to a functional, resilient place, because that is going to benefit folks who have the most compromised or vulnerable access most disproportionately fastest. And so I think thinking about how we are both kind of applying it from let's make sure those folks get project dollars right now, but also making sure that there's an equity lens around results and speed and scale. I don't know how to necessarily square those. And, I think that's the challenge that you're seeing with the Justice 40 rollout, with everybody being like, I don't know if I like this. But I think I'm glad to see that there's that lens. I think we'll just have to figure out how to place it at different levels.
Awesome. Thank you all. So I think we have time for one more question. And this one is just to zoom out a little bit and look at the United States more in the context globally. So Europe has been doing sort of these things and creating marketplaces for a little bit longer than we have. And so just love your thoughts on lessons learned and sort of big takeaways from other countries' efforts as we move forward here.
Tim, you went to Sweden, right? So you should know.
I was just seeing if anybody else had some ideas first. I think what Europe's doing in the ag subsidy space is amazing in terms of moving toward outcome-focused conservation subsidies for farmers. And we've written a little bit about this, but Ireland in particular is transforming, more than $1 billion of their traditional conservation subsidy streams into a program. I think the reach is 40 to 50,000 farmers, so a very large chunk of Ireland's farmers who will be rewarded for producing, a diversity of biodiversity and a set of biodiversity and water quality outcomes, where the program payments there's still practice payments, right? Because you still have costs as a producer to get there, but a large chunk of the payments are tiered toward what you deliver, what you're producing at the end. And that's to me a fantastic transformation. And at least some of the pilot programs that we've looked at appear to be operating with a lot more transactional efficiency than any of USDA's efforts to do this. With the exception, Jason, I love what the Outcomes Fund is doing. And my question in my mind for you on that one is like, why does USDA or NRCS still need to be involved? Like, could you guys just operate a program at scale? But those ag subsidies are to me one of the more interesting things. And of course, we're having this discussion at the same time that the COP on biodiversity is happening in Canada, and there's a whole conversation going on about biodiversity and finance that is huge, and absolutely a lot we could learn from that as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you, everyone. I think with the last 2 minutes, I'm gonna send it back over to Sarah to wrap us up.
Thanks, Grace. And thank you again to all our panelists. We so appreciate you being here today. So thanks for your time. So just a reminder, we did record today, so we'll be sending out a link next week to everyone who registered with the recording of this webinar. And I'll also collect links to some of the resources that were shared by our presenters, and I can include that in the email as well. So links to those videos, links to the Conservation Finance Act, and some comments on that, and links to some of the programs that Jason talked about. So take care. If you'd like to sign up for future webinars, there will also be opportunities to do that in the email that I follow up with, and hope to see you at future sessions. Thanks, everyone.